Welcome. We'll go straight to it. Thank you so much for joining. Today we have Debbie Whelan. Most of us know her a lot. She's been an academic in this country for many years. My former lecturer as well, actually. So I'll introduce her and then she will go through her presentation. Thank you, Debbie, for joining us. So Debbie Whelan is an associate professor at the University of Lincoln. Her research is focused on subaltern and in between. She is a land expert in KZN, and much of the information from these investigations trigger publications exploring the gap between the binaries of modernity and traditional spaces. Debbie, the floor is yours.
Goodness gracious. Well, hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, which is, I think, the intention anyway. As I said to Skura just now, I'm actually a team specialist, not a Zoom. So I'm hoping you can see that. Okay, and
yes,
I
I can see that.
Slideshow from the beginning. Hallelujah. Okay. So thank you, everybody, and I'm absolutely delighted to be invited to do this. It's I suppose a sort of in a lot of ways it's a culmination of quite a long journey through a variety of different sort of different spaces, and I think that I'm trying to make this presentation as unconfusing as possible, but at the same time it confuses me. So, please forgive me on that. So I've called it Working at the Edge of Change, New Homes, Alternative Paradigms and Aspirations. And this is really sort of continuing thinking. I'm not saying by any means that this is a particular sort of theme that I hold close to me, but it's continued thinking about societies and change. And I think that the way in which I've sort of gone through my academic life has been looking at societies and change. So the abstract that I submitted was aspirational dwellings. People call them amapillars. There are a lot of other names. Top billing homes was what I started using to describe them probably about 15 years ago. For want of a working nomenclature, litter the landscape of not only KwaZulu-Natal, but the country as a whole. And I think we know this. Replacing traditional villages in the Eastern Cape, they are subaltern indicators of development, aspiration, and they also unseat the official discourse of service delivery. And I think this is really important because these homes exist in between the official and the seriously rural. So this paper discusses the phenomenon as a practical evidential solution to possibly finding a middle ground in contemporary South Africa. And also in terms of, I think it's really important for the architectural profession to start stimulating discourse as to the very, and we're going back to the 1930s now, or even 1910 when Union period architecture started, the very long sort of question of what is architecture in South Africa? What is a South African style? So my intention is really to start looking at the proliferation of self-built homes, which have become, particularly in the last 10 years, prolific in our countryside and also in our cities. So I'm also very conscious of presenting the material here as evidential and provocative rather than as a curiosity. And I'm saying this because in my studies, occasionally lecturers would present architectures of the other as something which could be humorous or something which is a curiosity. And I've also realized that this is really important because these are not curiosities. These are fundamental everyday manifestations of built material culture. And so I think it's also important, I know that there are quite a few people in the session, There are many, many, many of you who don't know me at all, even though Skura said that you possibly do know me. So there is a necessary need for an introduction. Okay, so bits and pieces of this come from presentations I did when I was in KZN working at DUT, and really sort of part of the women in architecture in KZN. And introducing me, I think, is really important because I've also realized that our DNAs, our architectural DNAs, are really embedded in the way in which we engage with our lives, engage with societies, and we learn and we grow. And, you know, Cat Stevens notwithstanding, yes, I am a currently old white woman. I wasn't always an old white woman, but my background and my sort of progress through life, I think, is quite important. So I studied architecture at the University of Natal. There is a picture of, I think, my second or third year group. Many of you are possibly in there. Many people are now currently abroad. But certainly I realize now, studying or working in England, working at universities in England, that we had one of the best educations, architectural educations that one could get. My time at the University of Natal was enhanced by lecturers such as Rodney Harbour, Barry Bierman, Derek van Heerden, people who really enriched our understanding of where we were sitting in society at the time. And the studies when I was at the University of Natal were very much embedded in community and were very subaltern, given the position that South Africa was in the late 1980s. I also worked behind a bar for many years, and I say this with great pride because waitressing and working behind a bar was one of the most important parts of my life because it meant that I was able to engage with different people from different backgrounds and also be able to understand the multiplicity of, I suppose, aesthetic understandings. I learned to use a computer quite late. The picture of me in the bottom left-hand corner was whilst I was working at BESG, and I'm sure there are a couple of colleagues who worked with me at BESG for a couple of years who possibly remember my reticence with being able to use a computer. And so the life journey sort of is not always something which is instinctive. We all joined, interestingly, and I'm just saying this now because I see falling waters in the bottom there, but many of us started architecture in the late 80s, sort of really strong advocates of Frank Lloyd Wright. And I'm really interested to see with the students at the University of Lincoln now, particularly, that there is a strong move back to the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, not as an early modernist, but more in terms of his engagement with landscape and sort of light touch on the land, in inverted commas. So these are all sort of circular conversations. I struggled through my undergrad and my postgrad, largely because I wasn't particularly focused. And I had many other things going on, like working behind a bar, for example. And then I went to work for BESG for a couple of years. And this was also really important because my time working at BESG was right on the cusp of 1994. And it really exposed me to realities of living without the suburbs. We were working in Pisang's River. We were working in Luganda in southern Pinetown. There were many other projects which we were involved with. And I've also realized later in life that what we were doing then, what we were doing in 1990, is something which in the global north is only becoming obvious now. So sorry, this is a bit of a ramble. So I then went to work for Amartha, and I was a built environment cultural officer. And Amartha built on a lot of the sort of community development stuff I was working with at BESG, but it also gave me a really deep understanding of rural landscapes and rurality in general, but also started off well, it's a very long-term interest and understanding of Zulu culture. The monument to the Zulu fallen at St. Juana, which is below, has been recently dismantled, shall we say. And I supervised the project for about 3 months. And that project supervision led me to the next stage. I spent 3 months working in the States, in New Mexico. And this sort of sutured on to the developmental work that I'd been doing in South Africa with BESG. I was working with a company called Cornerstones Community Partnerships, who were specialists in working with communities on fixing up adobe constructions. And the church you see below was built in the 17th century, and we were busy repairing it, making adobes, doing the lime plastering. And the group that you see in the bottom left-hand corner was a group of kids who had been ordered to do community service, largely because they'd been involved in drugs, because this is a sort of Texas borderlands. And so the whole idea of the sort of community stuff was fleshed out more fully. My work in Isandlwana, or my work sort of working at Amafa, also led me to drive through Msinga. And I was traveling through Msinga very, very regularly. And the buildings which started emerging in Msinga in the sort of early 2000s, which were decorated, really triggered an idea of or a curiosity as to how these were actually being formed, why they were being decorated, how they were being decorated, and where the references came from. And Msinga is a really, really, really traditional area. It is much sort of revered by many people from Gauteng, who see women coming from Msinga particularly as being very traditional. But also at the same time, there has always been a tension between Msinga and then the Witwatersrand, because many men from Msinga from the very beginning in the 1880s went to the Witwatersrand in order to work on the mines. So this sort of tension of migrant labor has been something which has been endemic in this area, but it also strongly informed why these buildings were actually being decorated. So this sort of migrant movement backwards and forwards, the idea of image and aesthetic, which was being imported. So you can see in the image below, the air brick in the corner here, but also the blind window, was sitting at an intersection of really strong traditional understanding, but also integration of elements which were being imported, as it were, from the building sites on the reef. And so moving backwards and forwards from Isandlwana, this became my research master's, which I completed under Wally Peters in 2002. It was my first piece of research. And I think importantly, one of the things which happened while I was doing this was I realized that looking at these buildings as an architect was very different in understanding these buildings. And so this really started prompting me to go into anthropology. And architecture and anthropology are really interesting cognates to have together, because buildings then become a series of products of material culture rather than items which sit in the landscape. So this led me to do a Bachelor of Arts through UNISA. I did it in archaeology, anthropology, and English. And again, this sort of really broadened my understanding of how our existence in Southern Africa is actually shaped, and the sort of myriad influences which build us as a nation. In working at Amafa, I left Amafa, and then I started setting up a community development project working on historic buildings in Edendale and Maritzburg. And the images here are buildings constructed by the Amakolwa from 1855 onwards. The bottom right-hand image is an image of a building which is attributed to be the original home of Andries Pretorius. And it was one of the earliest buildings in Edendale, which forms part of the Edendale Higher Primary School. And the buildings above it, or the images above it, are the old manse. And I managed to find funding to be able to train people in Edendale how to do lime plastering, and we worked in repairing this building, the old manse. We worked in repairing it with lime plasters and also mud brick. And I think, Skura, that might have been even your cohort below, looking at the old Allison House in Edendale, which we never quite got to repairing. So this intersection with archaeology, architecture, and anthropology led me to work on a PhD. It was impossible when I was wanting to do the PhD to be able to do interdisciplinary studies in South Africa. So I tried at UKZN, but it wasn't really possible to sort of straddle these two areas. And I ended up going to the University of London, to the School of Oriental and African Studies, which was, I'm very glad I did it, but it was the most bizarre experience for a university which is meant to be at the forefront of transformation. The bigotry and the imperialism was absolutely breathtaking. And in the end, after a number of journeys, I ended up looking at Zulu traders in Zulu, at white traders in Zululand for my PhD, but particularly around the trading store as an iconic structure, and as a trigger for memory for people in South Africa. Not so much these days, but certainly the idea of this sort of mimetic idea of the trading store was really quite important in the 20th century. My long-enduring project in my mind, my big long-enduring project, is buildings which are circular. I've included Hilda Cooper's image from 1967 in the bottom right-hand corner of an Kugwan being moved in order to sort of position mobility as a really important part of the understanding of architecture and of buildings in the global south. But also, if we start looking at the igloo, we start looking at the yurt, and we start looking at the Whelan, and more recently, the Samigwati, these buildings all end up with the same sort of sense as we look at the sort of layout of the Kugwan below. So these things are really important. Space, gender, positioning in buildings or in structures as one moves through life have been things that I've been exploring. The next restoration project I undertook was working on the Mpopomeni Ecotourism Museum. This was also a house or a property attributed to Pretorius, but this is a site of dispossession, ironically, for the white owner of this house, who, when he was informed that the house was being expropriated for Mpopomeni, shot himself inside the house. But this really, this project is still ongoing, even though it's sort of at arm's length. And it is a project, it's a community-based project with which I'm very, very fond. And it's also meant that I could start exploring the sort of situation of the site, start exploring how we could actually make this into something which was a community structure more purposefully. Significantly, I think the sort of longevity of this project has meant that the site has become very accepted by the community because it's been seen as a bottom-up approach, very strongly as a bottom-up approach, rather than a top-down. And then the interest in the subaltern, whether it's the substations or municipal storage areas, these things still trigger much of my interest. So that's sort of really a brief background as to what I'm looking at. Moving on, a really significant World Heritage Commission request to go and do a monitoring mission in Nigeria at Oshogbo really sort of also started cementing my intersection between, I suppose, ancestral realms and physical realms, and the requirements and the differences of how we look at heritage in Africa. And this particularly triggered me because it was being done for people in Paris who had paradigmatic understandings which were totally different from the operations on the ground. And people who have really inspired me in my journey through this. And as Skura said, one of my side hustles when I was doing my PhD ended up being doing research for land claims. And I'm actually in South Africa at the moment doing research on land claims. But the intersection with architecture, built environment, land, access to land is actually a totally seamless construct. And so the land claim stuff that I'm doing at the moment is also allowing me to look at narrative and narrative construction and the rebuilding of heritage through the retelling of tales, which are about land and inhabitants. And they really are about intersecting stories, and the intersecting stories are multiple. And then we come back to the stuff that I do. So I'm the image of the Allison House in Edendale is put there together with Langali Balele, because Langali Balele is a great person of interest for me. And the fact that he sent his daughters to live with the missionaries at Edendale before the uprising in 1873, for me is a really important part of intersecting parts of our common and shared histories. And then also I did a lot of impact assessments. I went to Thomas More School when it was the place where you went if you were basically expelled from a Copa high school. But at the same time, impact assessments, particularly Clarewood Turf Club, led me to look at the buildings and the approaches of the architect who not only built the big house, great house at Thomas More, but the Clarewood Turf Club, looking at the DNA and the manner in which the Alan Woodrow, who was the architect, had developed his understanding and his implementation of Tudor-Beathan architecture. So all of this stuff sort of comes up as part of my academic development. So a lot of this was a series of events which mark a move into the next phase, a largely unplanned adventure. And, you know, I didn't really have a plan, let's be brutal, but also continuous transformation of landscapes and ideas. And a lot of the stuff that I'm doing at the moment, particularly sort of thinking about the top billing houses, is really about continuous transformation. And continuous transformation is one thing which we in South Africa do very, very well. But also the people that sort of intersect with all of these have really been important in shaping a lot of my understanding, but a lot of my approaches to being able to articulate much of the stuff that I'm presenting. So if we start looking at the top billing houses, we've got to understand the buildings, and I'm using the word buildings specifically, and I'll speak specifically about KwaZulu-Natal. We've got to understand the buildings of KwaZulu-Natal as a specific sort of series of processes. So the historical polemics are marginalization of the indigenous people through legislative and social means. And we're looking here at not only some of the early acts which post-1913 formed what we would call the apartheid system, but we're also looking at really critical points in history, such as the hut tax from about 1849, but also the Natal Code of Native Law, which was originally constructed by Theophilus Shepstone in 1864, but it was promulgated in 1891. And this Natal Code of Native Law became the traditional authority legislation, which is still enduring today. So this Natal Code of Native Law was written by the British in order to be able to standardize the different sort of traditional approaches, but it also created standardization about lobola. It created standardization about how chiefships were related, but critically, it also standardized the way in which umuzi and homesteads were formed. So these things are really important in sort of being able to underpin some of the stuff which is happening. Then we had apartheid and separate development, as well as paternalistic approaches towards housing and town planning. And here I'm speaking about Culverwell and his work in the 1940s, and then work also in the 1940s, which was trying to promote the use of earth building, mud brick, which then became not only paternalistic, but also really drove a lot of the move towards brick and concrete being much more desirable materials to use. So these things are quite important. Then we look at the Western lens. Arts and crafts was deployed as domestic architecture. It reinforced the nature of the empire. We had Victorian, Edwardian, and local adaptations. We had religious architectures from mainland India. We had a colonial revival at the end of the 1970s. We had the Spanish revival between the 1950s and 1960s. The absolutely bizarre Tudor-Beathan revival in the 1930s, which was drawn straight from the Tudor-Beathan revival as a reaction to political identity after World War I in England. We had Art Deco, and then also the Union period, which was significant application of politics to architecture. So all of this stuff is in the mix of our DNA, our provincial DNA. Then on the other hand, we've got indigenous building methods, and I still love that image from Cooper. I was absolutely gobsmacked the other day when I did a presentation to colleagues at Lincoln, and I was talking about the homestead, or the circularity of space, and the way in which the domical form evokes much more than just a circular building platform or a circular building footprint. It invokes for many people memory. It invokes for many people a deep connection with gender, with spirituality, with the ancestors. And I was told by a colleague who's very bright that that's absolute nonsense, that actually everybody knows that traditional buildings or vernacular buildings are totally determined by material. And we know that's not so. We know that material is very important in how these are constructed, particularly thatch in KwaZulu-Natal because of its relationship with the ancestors. But indigenous building methods are really important in being able to understand also these parts of our DNA. But at the same time, all of us sitting here in the room as architects know fundamentally that it's the application of indigenous building methods is also incredibly problematic in being able to look at post-colonial architectural landscapes. And this is just an image which Wyndham Hartley took in the 1970s, which is in Msinga. Many of you might know that it's what people would call goat country. So even though it's not sitting on a reasonably flat landscape, the central cattle pattern, as was posited by Tim Maggs in the late 1980s, is still very enduring. And the hierarchies, the social hierarchies and the building hierarchies in the space are still really evident. Then we sort of come to more contentious forms of building. And I've written about Nkandla and its relationship to space, to creating neo-vernaculars, to creating neo-traditional buildings, in being able to start evoking a traditional resurgence, particularly with Zulu identity. And so these building types sit alongside our formal architectures, our informal architectures, and then also our self-built architectures. So the colonial built environment I'm also really interested in, because in KwaZulu-Natal particularly, the resistance to moving towards formal square buildings is evidenced in aerial photographs until pretty much the 1980s in some cases, given that the implementation of square buildings started in about 1824 to some degree. Cetshwayo had an orthogonal building constructed at Ondini Homestead in the late 1870s. So the idea of orthogonal buildings was there, but I suspect that a strong connection to the hut tax in the second part of the 19th century, but also assertive resistance to the amapillars, who didn't pay hut tax because they lived in square buildings, is part of the reason why the sort of the circularity prevailed. But also the resistance to the colonial built environment is problematic in its definition, but it's also politicized. And this was really sort of foregrounded. It was foregrounded by the 2015 Fees Must Fall, which then became the which then became the Roads Must Fall, ethnic resistance internationally, but certainly in KwaZulu-Natal and working at AMAFA, my knowledge is that the colonial built environment was being politically marginalized from pretty much the sort of early 2000s. And so these are all the tensions within which we work. There is also this sort of desperate need. I mean, I remember when I was a student, there was this desperate need to try and find an intrinsic Southern African identity. This goes back to the 1930s when one of the sort of local lifestyle magazines in the 1930s was issued a competition for architects to design South African homes. It goes back to the Union period, in which the sort of construct of the Union period buildings were a melange of the Dutch and the British architectural styles in order to be able to glue together groups which even till today don't necessarily see eye to eye. And I think architects, particularly after 1994, started engaging in the sort of idea of cognitive hybridity. And it was really an academic search for a local identity. And how much it works, I'm not sure, because these are constructs from without. And if I look at Luis Ferreira's really beautiful Legislative Assembly of the Northern Cape Province, many of the references in that building are totally and utterly alien to people that live in the Northern Cape. The Africa Centre in Tuba is also one of the examples of being able to try and engage with this cognitive hybridity, and also engage with the buildings within its context. And this is what architects have been trying to do. And then a building which I'm actually quite critical about, because although this was an award-winning structure or award-winning building, again, the sort of highly celebrated arches and domes, which the architect let or sort of engaged with local people in order to construct them, Mediterranean domes are totally irrelevant in sort of the Limpopo area. And I think if we start looking at all of the skills transfer which would have happened and the social inclusion of people in building the building, they're not going to go out and start building mud brick domes. So this for me, again, is a little bit of a sort of an attempt to create something which isn't necessarily part of a local understanding of how buildings are formed. And then also Rodney Koromansky's also very beautiful building. which again, for me, is quite alien in its setting. And its reference points do not necessarily resonate with the people for which it is representing. So again, it's the sort of academic sort of positioning of how do we put buildings into space, but then what is the actual purpose and who are the people using them, which is the cognitive dissonance. So if we start looking at the hybrid houses, okay, and I'm saying this because we've got a community of architects in the room here. They are subaltern. They are perhaps for many of us absolutely invisible. They mess with our stuff. They subvert all the common tropes of development and economy. They are independently forming their own aesthetic frameworks and are thus tastemakers. And they're an entire subaltern and invisible phenomenon. So this is what people want, okay? Some of these images, well, these images are quite old, but people in KwaZulu-Natal, in South Africa, are rapidly developing their own vernaculars without the gaze of the architect. They're developing their own vernaculars from a variety of different positions. Their vernaculars, and I think that this particular example in the center for me is quite important because the incredibly daring construction of how those pillars work on the veranda for me is part of something that is connected with another greater discussion which will come much later. But this is the South African vernacular. And I think as soon as architects wake up and realize that the reference points, which are important, need to be included in the way in which we approach design, whether we like it or not, we're actually losing a profession. So we're looking at also the way that I'm sort of seeing a lot of this is looking at what we would call articulate. So if we say that in this room, the people who are in this room are all architects, they've all gone through the same training with the same information provided or similar information provided, with an entire 6 or 7 years of taste making, which has been created in the process of becoming an architect, we would consider ourselves within this framework of the built environment as being articulate. Whereas the people, the clients, and this is probably clients regardless, most clients could be considered as being inarticulate. And this comes from Raymond Williams in 1985. And this really was used by Barbara Bender, who was an archaeologist at the University College of London, who really worked within the postmodern framework, looking at how structures are read through time and are read by different people. And this means that there are tensioned identities. So there's this tension between our identity as architects and this idea of the taste that we've made or the taste that we've learned, and then the clients. So there's this tension in understanding. But Raymond Williams really used this. He was from Wales, and he found that when he went to university and he went back to Wales, and this is an experience for many of us in the room, the language that he was using at university, the experiences that he was getting at university, when he went back to Wales, his family couldn't understand him. And so this sort of family living in Wales, which led a life determined by survival and routine, don't explain their worlds because they don't necessarily interrogate them. Whereas coming from a university background, these interrogations start to happen. So there is this dissonance in being able to understand the relationships. And this he considered was an inarticulate understanding. So I think if we start thinking about this in terms of the clients, not only our clients as architects, but perhaps the clients of many of these buildings, these top billing buildings, if we start looking at these which are juxtaposed with a professional architect or academic who has cognition in terms of abstract knowledge. We can view systems from without, and we've got the leisure to view for what others do not need to be explained. So if we can start sort of understanding this tension between what needs to be built and what we're doing. And so if we start thinking that this analysis suggests that the profession and the educated elite situate ourselves in the latter, whilst the average man in the street considers his house and provision of shelter for his family as an object at face value and not as one that has to be explained. So what you see is what it is. So a lot of this is coming towards ideas of conspicuous consumption. And so if we start looking at these buildings as the new reality, it's self-determined hybrid architectures, and it's part of quotidian discussion. And I mean, for example, there might be some of my old students in the room here, but this particular page comes from a whole series of discussions which were on a public Facebook page, and that again is now looking at digital research. But it's how these start becoming open discussions about identity, about control of the environment, about pride as to how these buildings have taken over rural landscapes and allow for a really new social and political standing for many people. It also means that the way in which these buildings are marketed are totally contrary to the way in which architects would expect themselves to market. So marketing is done through Instagram, marketing is done through Facebook, marketing is done through Spotify. It's an entirely different paradigm of building construction. So the rationale, and I've done quite a lot of work with former students. We do have a paper in production, well, not in production, but in the crafting at the moment, about this. So they are co-creators with me. But the experience of these buildings is that they are found, I mean, I think the Umbumbulu Road was one of the sort of first areas which started becoming quite densely populated. But also if we look out of Maritzburg, sort of Fox Hill particularly has become absolutely flooded with these buildings in recent times. But they involve people moving out of the city. People moving out of the city because they can't afford 300,000 Rand for a two-roomed house in Mbali. They're moving out of the city because they don't want to pay municipal rates and electricity connections. There is a narrative of returning back to the land because you can keep cattle and you can slaughter without having to notify anybody. So there is this entire disobedience, and I use that following Erich Fromm because it really is about a self-determination and a self-agency which is really growing in opposition to much of the control which happened during apartheid and late apartheid. These buildings allow for incremental construction. The role of the architect a lot of the time is not as a site agent, is not as a project agent, but the role of the architect is part of the narrative of not of preference, but part of the narrative of the construct of modernity, but part of the construct of the preference of the types of buildings. So incremental construction means that people can do this over a long period of time. It means they can build it as they need to build it. There's no rush on getting it finished in order to follow municipal requirements. They did demonstrate conspicuous consumption, and this is following Whelan in the late 19th century. And the conspicuous consumption is the house the house, the message of the house, the message of arrival, the message of being able to emulate perhaps what you had seen or perhaps what you had aspired to over many, many years. In the Transkei, for example, in the Eastern Cape, many of these buildings are remittance homes. And what strikes me driving through the Eastern Cape is that communities which previously would have been 3 or 4 rondavels or buildings which were traditional buildings have rapidly been replaced by Gauteng style three car garages and massive homesteads, generally in the style of the Tuscan. And these remittance homes basically subvert the national development agenda and the expectations of government. All of this is happening without the authorities. And given that the first census that happened since 2011 happened, I think, last year, it means that actually nobody knew that all of this was going on. And the sort of tropes of needing to be able to upgrade people in the Eastern Cape continued by the authorities, because this massive injection of money coming in from the cities through remittances meant that this was not being picked up. And also significantly, and I think this is quite important, because in the same way as cattle are used to launder cash, many of these cash-built homes, which form many of these homesteads, are conduits for money laundering. And so there's all these sorts of things that are going on, which are beyond our Western ideas of how buildings are constructed and what our norms are. They're lifestyle driven, and certainly top billing was quite an important driver for this. The phenomenon of the Tuscan comes out of particularly the construction of Monte Cassino in Johannesburg. It drove Tuscan estates, particularly in Johannesburg, and these reference points were brought back across the country in this aesthetics. Zimbabwe and other upmarket residential estates also contribute, because these are the aspirational templates which are used in the construction and implementation of these buildings. I think it's also important to say, it's just struck me now, that when I was working for Amafra, I used to travel to Ulundi quite often, and some of the first RDP houses, and I would say this is about 1999, some of the first RDP houses in the Melmoth area were starting to put plaster coining on the walls of their homes. And this again was a reflection of the incursion of the visual markers of the Tuscan. Again, it also means that we've started to change our methodologies of thinking. Digital fieldwork. The digitization is really important, because much of the narrative, much of the understanding of what these buildings mean for us articulate, in inverted commas, does come from understanding the digital landscape and understanding the requirements and the needs of people for architects and architectural professionals within their paradigms of thinking. We need to work with an articulate profession to understand an inarticulate clientship, and we need to be able to link these much more meaningfully. We need to rework the idea of the professional and the client, where the professional is prestige. Sorry, that was a word I was trying to find much earlier. So the professional is hired by many of the clients of these buildings because it's part of the prestige of the building. It's not because they're necessarily going to give exactly what the client requires. And they're not necessarily as a critical part of a design and submission process. So, I mean, start to think of this theoretically, because that's what academics are supposed to do. So old theories such as Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption 1899, particularly picked up and demonstrated in the Edwardian era, but certainly conspicuous consumption is part of our everyday life in a post-neoliberal society, and certainly in a postmodern and post-colonial society, because what we show people we've got is our projection of ourselves. This also builds on the requirement for identity creation in fractured societies, and so these buildings and these homesteads and these landscapes are beginning to, as these Facebook pages show, are really about the ability of individuals and communities to position themselves within a new South Africa. It also works firmly within the realm of post-truth and post-colonial societies, as well as interpretation through neo-colonialism frameworks, redefining positions in society and moving from tribal frameworks of headship and also family to wealth class. Okay, so it's all of the shifting societal requirements. So we're looking at the gray areas of profession, okay? And this is also, and it's also work that I've been doing with students. We know that these are side hustles, unregistered professionals, which are often lacking qualifications, but it also speaks to a rapidly growing middle class with overt requirements to demonstrate success, and speaks very clearly to a very changed financial model in which long-term overcapitalization is not an issue, but short-term benefits of visual presentation are. And I think this is where these subversions and the subaltern for me are so important. So I think that what's really critical here is my sort of first interrogations into these buildings is on a stretch of road leading out of Maritzburg towards Thornville. The land is owned by, and this is something I've known for a long time, Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh has basically allowed people to move onto his property as tenants or not as tenants. The investment, the massive investment of capital into these buildings is something which for a Western trope is totally bizarre, given that the lack of security of tenure is so problematic. And so all of these understandings of capitalization of money, of how money works, of how investment works, of how the relationship between properties on land work. And then the next layer is that this particular landowner now wants to demolish these illegal mansions before the elections. There's this, again, this whole sort of circular discussion of how these buildings are actually situated on the land and situated with their environments. So for me, I think, you know, a lot of decolonization is not necessarily us proving that we had it, but it's us proving the knowledge that we can contribute to people in the global north. And I think it's a much more elegant way of positioning ourselves in the global south. And I was very struck by a presentation which a very intelligent colleague of mine in Lincoln, he's an archaeologist, he presented a paper called Europeanization and the Development of a Grammar of Masonry in 10th to 12th century England. And the 10th to 12th century England, I mean, these are areas in which people get quite obsessed. But Mark Gardner works particularly, not necessarily in England, but in the very far north of Scotland, on the Faroe Islands, and also moving across to Iceland. And he is looking at that intersection of the sort of late Viking incursions and Viking settlement in northern Scotland, and also the transfer of, or the sort of the construction of buildings in this particular period, particularly in stone. Now, part of this sort of period particularly in England, is that much of the stonework was actually carried out by French masons who were imported to England because they had the skills to be able to do the stonework. But what struck me in this particular presentation was the experimental construction of a building, which resonated very strongly with many of these buildings that we see in these hybrid houses. And this experimentality with structure, with space, with form is coming out of a particular social dynamic and social dynamic of change, or social change dynamic. And in a lot of ways, I think that we can start looking at some of these constructs in archaeology through the lens of our experiences here. And for me, that is actually a very powerful potential to be able to contribute knowledge and actually build our knowledge selves as significantly important in the sort of decolonization, recolonization process. I must also just say, and I didn't manage to get the slide in at the beginning, is that these forms of buildings are not new. These forms of buildings are documented around the world, obviously with different types of reference points. My first encounter with them was a paper at the International Association of Traditional Environments conference in 2004, when one of the presenters was looking at what she was calling Mediterranean mansions in Australia. And it was particularly Greek immigrants presenting buildings or designing buildings in order to be able to reference their structures that they had come from, or their aspirations which they had come from in Greece. It's perfectly natural. Many of the white settlers in Natal, in anywhere in South Africa, were also building buildings which were aspirational to the types of buildings they came from, or which they aspired to when they had left England. There is a lot of work, particularly in Mexico, particularly around remittance buildings in Mexico, or remittance settlements and remittance landscapes, as Lopez suggests, in Mexico. So these are things which are part of rapid urbanization and also rapid social change. So I think for me, and I've been criticized by really important people in the global north for saying this, but actually something is always new coming out of Africa. And I think we've got to really take that and run with the knowledge that we are creating and the knowledge which we are able to contribute in order to be able to work within this rapid change. So thank you very much for listening. Have I done my hour? Goodness.
Thank you so much, Debbie.
Goodness. Sorry,
Yeah,
that was
to the second, actually.
a bit, sorry guys, it was a bit random because I was just saying that I lost my work. The first set of presentations that I did, I lost last night. So I hope you sort of got the basic understanding of what I'm trying to say.
Very, very rich presentation, Prof. Thank you so much, Debbie. I wanted to just speak further about the issue of self-determination. The new architecture coming up. The 150 plus people on this log, architects, have their own way of seeing what cool is, what should be done.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and then there is a way that people say, no, I actually want this. This is what I want. And you will have clients who would lean towards what architects are more inclined to do, etc., etc.
Yeah.
In your view, how important is this discussion, and how important is this discussion, and how do you marry the two? How do you marry the intellectual's view of architecture Now, this is now beyond the most important things of sustainability and context, which you have to educate your client about, all right? But now, in terms of the overall poetry of how the building looks, how do you marry the two between your client who wants something else and yourself as an architect who recognizes something else is more important?
Well, I think this has always been, I mean, you know, I think this has always been the big crisis for architects, is having clients who don't necessarily understand. But I think in this particular context, these are client-driven houses. So very strongly client-driven houses. As I said, the architect is often employed as prestige rather than as a necessary requirement. So it's a lot of it is sort of connecting the dots, but it's the sort of intention, I think, is quite different from the sort of formal sort of aspect of the profession. My sort of word on this is that the profession cannot ignore this. In a lot of ways, we've had all of these SACAP nyagas and all of this sort of transformation stuff. And in a lot of ways, I'm absolutely delighted that in many people are putting bread on their table and feeding their families through totally subaltern and side hustle means, because that's what it is. It's a form of existence for many people. And it does basically disempower the architects who are going through the formal process, who SACAP registered, the whole sort of toot as far as that's concerned. So it sort of exists on these two paradigms, and they're both equally important. The way in which these intersection, I think the big challenge is being able to intersect or understand this paradigmatic disjunct, if that makes sense. With my land claim stuff, and I'm sort of jumping now because I'm looking, a lot of the stuff that I'm looking at is really connected to the fact that we live in parallel worlds here. And with my land claims work, I've realized that we are sitting between a society which works at the interface of traditional authority law, hashtag promulgated by the British in 1891, which is effectively talking about oral histories and resource management, whereas the Western paradigm of law speaks about very strong binaries of right and wrong and truth and lies. And what I've found is that in the process of adjudication in the courts, these are being negotiated so that restitution is happening, but it happens in the gray space between the paradigmatic right and wrong, or the sort of binary of right and wrong, and the resource management of traditional authority law. And this is the same thing. We're looking for that gray area, if that makes any sense. We're looking for the gray area or the intersections, which are going to be the place in which our society becomes sustainable. So it's how do we create those intersections of, it's possibly just understanding that these are necessary and they're important. They might not be necessarily ideal to us as architects, but they are fundamentally important in the development of our new society. If that makes any sense.
Thank you, Debbie. I think it's a very important debate because in South Africa, architects are not recognized by authorities and architects are not recognized by people on the ground. So you have this group of people in the middle
Absolutely.
who actually, I mean, I do bids for large scale projects for PRASA and Transnet, and those projects are led by project managers and engineers. Government just sees you as a purifier. I mean, you can speak around the room now, people who do shopping centers. You get squeezed to the corner as well. I mean, that's now private, right? And then you also have what is to many people the daily bread, of the housing and all that and all that. And so we're just floating in the middle. It's our profession is definitely in jeopardy if you look at it in the long run. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for that, Debbie. Could you just elaborate more about land claims, your involvement there? I was in a talk in the Eastern Cape recently. The Premier of the Eastern Cape was just doing a land audit in the Eastern Cape in terms of who owns what land is used for agriculture. And unfortunately, subsistence farming in the Eastern Cape has shrunk over the past 10 years from when I was a child growing up there. So there's a company from Joburg led by chartered accountants. It's got agricultural engineers, civil engineers, and all sorts of people who have done land audit for the whole country. By the way, if
Goodness.
you're looking for stats on that, I know them. But I just want for you, David, to just elaborate on your involvement in the land situation in the country, just on the overall view.
So I saw Wally in Cape Town last week or whatever, and I said to him, "What the hell do I talk about at this lecture?" And he said, "Speak about your land work." And then I thought, no, let me talk about these buildings. And I'm very, very happy to do another one on the land claim stuff, if you want me to do that. So basically, I have been doing anthropological historical research. So it's really sort of looking at the sort of history of occupation of land. It's working in between the intersections of mapping, surveys, settlement, who got there first, what the sort of narratives are about land, but only from the empirical position. So what I've realized in the process is when I started this, I used to go and interview people and all the rest of the stuff. But I've realized that over the years, I've realized that I'm employed as an expert to produce evidence in a court which requires evidence. Okay, because it's the Western landscape of legislation. And I think that's where the big problem is that when all these new legislations were written in the early 90s, they were written with a Western paradigm and they didn't sort of intersect with the indigenous sort of understandings of space or practice. And I'm talking about health and all sorts of things. So I work with the material that's evidenced. And then the claimants will come in with oral histories, and oral histories will change during the process of court, depending on what the negotiated outcome amongst the group is necessary. And so these are then put in front of the judge and the assessor, and they're all interrogated in a full court of law. And again, I'm very happy to give a talk about this. But what happens is the judge, since the Salem judgment, I think in 2017, which was in the Eastern Cape in Grahamstown, the way in which this has been finessed is that oral history is slowly becoming part of the narrative of these judgments. So we're sitting within a really, really interesting space in this country where legislation is actually being crafted, which overlays the sort of Western paradigm and also the paradigm of most of the inhabitants of the country, if that makes sense. Sorry, I saw Mtunzi put a note up there. Mtunzi, I drove past some walls yesterday, and why I'm saying this is part of some of the early thinking around this. And Mtunzi Dumakuda gave a paper at the Bloemfontein conference, students' conference many years ago, about how people were presenting conspicuous consumption by the ways in which they were walling, creating boundary walls around their houses. So, Mtunzi, you were actually part of some of the early sort of thinking of this. Okay, I don't know if that actually helps you.
Yeah,
Skura.
that helps. That helps. I do think that then a follow-up talk on land on its own, or land claims, would actually be very, very useful.
Yeah, no, Wally said it would be interesting or useful, and then I thought, no, it's probably not quite the right forum. But as I say, if people are interested, it's a really interesting space to be in. Because it's so contested.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Debbie. I think that presentation and those responses absolutely enriching. Colleagues, I'll open up now for anybody who has a comment or a question for Debbie.
Askara, can I?
Yes, sure, you can go.
Debbie, thanks very much for your talk, and really fascinating. And I'm particularly fascinated, and I wanted when you use reference to Mzansi, because Mzansi is the place that what has become a new hero in my life, G.G. Alcock, developed. He grew up with his parents. They sold everything, well, they gave away everything, and lived there, and he lived in the community there. And he has developed the whole theory on Kassanomics and the Kassanomic revolution. And particularly, and your reference to the housing, that is what I did. I posted on the chat a YouTube clip I watched recently where he was interviewed, and he gave already a 35-minute summary of what his theory is all about. Now, he talks about the informal economy being a 300 billion rand unrecognized economy in South Africa, because people don't have pay slips and things like that. Therefore, you are not formal. You're not recognized. You don't have a job. Work is not a job. So I just thank you for that, and thank you for enriching that. It's been a recent enlightening thing for me. It's given me a whole new perspective, and your talk this morning just added to it and supplemented that. So if you know G.G. Alcock, well then I don't need to say it. But if you don't, or you want to do it, be entertained for a bit, have a look at the YouTube reference I put on the chat.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure. Skura, is there any way I can get access to the chat just so I can respond to stuff after this?
Yeah, absolutely. We're recording the whole proceeding. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be able to see it. I'll be able to see the chat.
Yeah.
What's in the recording? Okay.
More time. Yeah, you can be. Yeah. I'm correct, Kiara, right?
Hi, Skura. Yes, I can send Debbie the chat.
Okay, lovely. Okay.
Hi. Yes. Hello. Thanks, Skura. Hi, Debbie.
Hello, Kirk.
You're looking well. I don't know why.
I told her, and then she just brushed me off like that.
I'm aging disgracefully. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I want to start with a bit of a query and a bit of a challenge, a professional one. In that,
good.
I have been, and it's the discipline of town planning. I don't know why in your multidisciplinary thinking, there's a huge amount of literature on this area that you're looking at, which falls within the town planning discipline, and it's a particularly thorny headache, so-called, for the South African state. And I'd hesitate to call it a Western paradigm in which town planners operate. I mean, they're operating from a paradigm of regulation and spatial control, and these ribbon developments, because these what I think Ora Jaber calls Boere Tuscan in her particular world, these maybe Zulu Tuscan. They all happen in strip developments along roads, and they are also unserviced. Huh? So definitely it is a remittance landscape. I think that's a beautiful statement from this Mexican fellow talking about a remittance landscape, because these are people who have access to the cash economy, who are living in town because that's the center of their lives, and then they're sending money back home for retirement homes or whatever. And, you know, the chief gives you permission, and that's it. And you get this wall-to-wall development along highways. And yeah, that's a huge, well, it is a new spatial form, which is evolving. My more or less my challenge here is, I think Richard Pithouse, which many of us would know very well, he once asked me, what does architecture have to offer to housing? Now, this comes from a very, very sophisticated thinker. And I'm not sure how I can answer Richard Pithouse's question. Does architecture have anything to offer housing? I'm not sure any of us can answer that, but I really think it's not something we ask enough. Tony Wilson, a colleague of ours, said architecture has nothing to offer housing. Huh? I mean, Tony was very, very strong on those grounds. So I think this challenge, if you're looking at this thing called housing, I think we need to stop being architects and to face this issue a lot more squarely. I think your issue on the land, to move on, the land issue is very interesting, because the process of land, the legal processes, which are different to the architectural processes and the way we move forward and develop, is that there's jurisprudence and that case laws slowly build up, which then have to be responded to. So I think the way the legal profession is transforming is through this oral testimony, which is brought by people who have absolutely no interest in the legal process, and they have what they know, and that's their testimony.
Yeah.
So lawyers are having to include the oral testimony in their legal judgment. So the jurisprudence is actually transforming in much the same way that our and that is an insurgence in a way. It's coming from below.
Absolutely.
So I find that is a very important thing. But I think maybe my question to you now, a central one for me, a central interest which I have, and it's going back to, I must thank you, because you kind of shook me 2 or 3 years back into an awareness of Hilda Cooper. She's the lady, for everyone else listening to us. You introduced me to that diagram, that photograph of the moving hut. Hilda Cooper had a very problematic relationship and killed the career of Regina Twala, and all of that is now coming out, how the foremost white anthropologist actually destroyed the career of an emerging and substantial anthropologist. And it creates a very problematic intersection between professionals on a personal level. And I think part of the tension there between Regina Twala and Hilda Cooper was one of the transformation on how things are changing. And how do you actually interpret these changes? And for me, I'm very interested in, and I find a silence on this. Where is when we look at the stuff, well, it was actually Adam Cooper more than
Hilda,
Tim
yeah.
Maggs who did this stuff. You mentioned Tim Maggs. I think Adam Cooper is a wonderful fellow. He needs to be acknowledged for the cattle pattern and that the enduring presence of the central cattle pattern in modern houses, in square square buildings where you park your SUVs in the middle of the houses as a protection logger. And for me, is a resonance of the cattle pattern.
Absolutely.
And I found that fascinating. But for me, what I'm really interested in is what happened to the umsamo in the modern.
So this was in my original presentation, and I lost it. And so for me, the umsamo is one of. So I was talking to Carolyn Hamilton, who is a really grown-up history person, and I was telling her about these sort of peripatetic landscapes, and you know, so if you live in an informal settlement, you'll go back to Eplazine to the umsamo, and then with many of these houses, the umsamo is moving, but it's whether there is the Ugubuyisa which goes with it as well. And so these are some of the questions that I want to sort of start asking, because for me, it's where are the ancestors, and how do the ancestors change? Because, and I think all of these questions, and Kirk, it's absolutely important. All of these questions actually come down to where is housing, because the RDP is not working.
Certainly.
And the Nats understood the importance of gender in spaces, and they would put the headmaster's office was on the right, and the kitchen was on the left. You know, so those sort of gendered spaces are things which are fundamentally instinctive for many people here. And these things are not being addressed in the development of housing. And for me, understanding this and understanding where the ancestors are starts to help in understanding our understanding of what informal settlements are, or primary settlements, or spontaneous settlements. You know, so it's all connected, and it's connected in our understanding. And I think it's understanding from the bottom, and it's understanding that this is enduring, and it will be enduring for probably many centuries, which is really important.
Sorry, I think in many ways the umsamo, particularly in informal, dense shackland areas, it has been outsourced to the Sangoma. That is the only place you can. So in a sense, it's also commodified, because you have to pay this fellow. So you don't have this presence in the center of your ancestral home anymore. And you have to engage with it in a very different way, in a way which has no spatial provision.
Absolutely.
And that could lead to a lot of psychological disturbance for people in very, very critical ways. So it brings in that psychological dimension to the home, which is old, these early vernacular guys. They were very good. Rappaport. No, we all need to read Rappaport again and again. Thank you.
So I think if there is something I'd really like to say, is my experience of the architectural profession in England is absolutely shocking. There is no handle on reality. The understanding of society is very poor. The humanness, or the humanity that we have as South Africans who have studied and worked in South Africa, I think is the most sustainable part of the profession. And it's obvious in the UK that architects have actually are working themselves out of jobs quite rapidly, because they're not dealing with the stuff at hand. And it's almost like we have to start repositioning the profession as built environment professionals rather than architects specifically. And this is just something that I've just been experiencing over the last 7 years of my tenure on the Soggy Island. So I think if that's something useful to think about in creating that intersection, that grey space, or working within that grey space, it's infinitely more sustainable than what is sort of certainly happening in much of the global north.
Interesting. Thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
May I please have any other hand or a comment? Karuni, are you happy? Oh, she's. You can go.
Yes, I'm happy.
Exactly at the same time, man.
I was typing a question in for Debbie. Lovely to see you, Debbie.
Sure.
Back in the colony.
Absolutely. Back in the colony, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know how the British actually managed to colonize the way that they're behaving at the moment, but anyway.
Yeah, so now I'm left with two words that you, concepts that you referred to quite often in your presentation, the subaltern and intersections. Yeah, which it resonates with me because, you know, if our profession is not diverse, it doesn't talk to where we come from. So can you talk about the teaching aspect of that? You know, we teach architecture, we teach the content of architecture, we teach history of architecture, we teach theory, we also teach practice. You know, how do we, you know, what is the implications of what you've just presented today in terms of pedagogy, in terms of academics teaching students architecture? And also the second question would be, what are the implications of lessons that institutions like the South African Institute of Architects could learn from your presentation in terms of how we manage ourselves as an institute and, you know, chart new directions in terms of where we should be going around transformation, etc.
So, I think that and I'm saying this because I've got a very good colleague, Mark Whelan, who started off doing geography, and he's also an architect, and he teaches with me at Lincoln. And my journey through architecture and archaeology and anthropology, and now history as well, although I'm not formally trained in history, I diversified because there wasn't much work to do when I graduated. I diversified because my brain was too busy with other things from making buildings. And I think that it's really important that architects must not be scared of multidisciplinary thinking. And perhaps one of the things which is important in teaching is to really embrace criticality, but also to get students to work within their own environments and their own thinking. At Lincoln, I've increasingly and quite unpopularly got students to do dissertations, for example. So one of my students comes from Port Harcourt, and he did his dissertation on corruption in the building industry in Nigeria, because there was a specific building which triggered him. Whereas before, what would have happened at Lincoln is he would have probably been coerced into doing something very British. And so it's being able to sort of have the courage to explore the diverse environments, which I think in architectural studies, we're not necessarily always given the opportunity to do anymore. And I also think that the old model which they had at UCT, I don't know if it still exists, of putting some of the alternative sort of humanities into architectural studies. And it's really difficult because I think we're continuously being pushed by the profession to reinforce practice, reinforce professionalism, reinforce health and safety, reinforce all the rubber stamping and all the legislative stuff, without allowing for some of that sort of broader criticality, which comes through interdisciplinary thinking or interdisciplinary working. And I think that that's what saved me, was being able to necessarily work without the profession, because when the big crash came, you know, I had all these other little bits and pieces that I could work on as well. So it's being able to work more broadly and being encouraged to work more broadly and being encouraged to work beyond architecture, because then that gives extra lenses through which we can view our world. I don't know, is that some sort of an answer? But also,
no, it is. I think I was more asking around the lack of I can understand your explanation about diverse thinking, and I agree with that. In a profession that lacks diversity in terms of the makeup of who is in the architectural profession, and who is teaching and who is creating architecture, you know, the output is not talking to the diversity that it should be talking, or it's not coming from the correct diversity in South Africa compared to most other countries.
Okay, so is it because it works with the DNA of the profession? And so if I think of Otto Wagner, you know, he was trained as a classicist, and when he started engaging with the new successionists, there was still a strong element of classicism because that was his training. And perhaps that training needs to actually build a diversity, and people need to be more confident in adding that diversity in, but it's only probably going to reflect in a couple of generations. You know, and I think that that's probably the problem, is perhaps we're expecting the diversity too quickly, whereas actually it's got to work its way through.
Yeah, it's you know, it's the way I see it, it's a participation of diversity. Then will then create that platform where you can draw on everything, you know, that you're able to draw on it. And it is about participating in the profession. We have a lot of our Black architects operate on the periphery of the profession. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the buildings are not seen to be of the same standard as something that wins an award, for example. So, you know, we sometimes don't understand that, you know, and you perpetuate the system by maintaining, you know, sort of a level of what is excellence. And we do it in teaching. We also do it, I mean, my opinion, that is, you feel free to disagree, in the way that we teach professional practice, the way that we practice professional practice, and just the way the whole profession works. But also it's a way, I just think if more diverse people are involved in education, the output would be a lot different. It would be easier to get diverse, you know, views on things and be able to differently. So in a space where that doesn't happen, what do we do? Do we just continue, or?
So, you know, I think also so there might be two things. There might be that we are presenting the wrong standards as being excellent, perpetuating a narrative. But also when I sort of spoke about the students at Lincoln now suddenly coming back, being enthusiastic about an architect who was practicing at the beginning of the 20th century, but for very different reasons. Perhaps it's an institutional reframing of position. I don't know. Far too confusing for a Friday morning.
No, thanks, Debbie. Thanks. Also, just another question. You mentioned it in your presentation. So what role do the colonies have in terms of engaging with the whole post-colonial sort of thinking, you know? What is our role? Is our role to contribute to the discourse? And who sorts our own problems out, you know? Back here.
So I think our role is, so I mean, I'm one of the things I'm trying desperately to do is to situate the Kruguan as one of the oldest building forms, okay, which it is. That's pretty much Mesolithic, and try and do so. So the only way I can actually start doing this is with comparative studies with the Guati and the Whelan and stuff like that. But it's very problematic to find an essential DNA, because DNA is empirical rather than being, you know, comparative. But also to be able to say, okay, so if we look at Skara Brae, and you watch presentations done by National Geographic or something reasonably professional about Skara Brae in northern Scotland, and you look at, and they present the Umsamo as a dresser, okay? Or you look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and you can see the construct of the building as being reflected in buildings we understand as an everyday. How can our subaltern lens in South Africa of everyday buildings contribute to understanding the deep past in the global north? So I think a lot of it is I mean, I see a lot of students on Facebook, you know, they sort of get very sort of angry about, you know, we did stuff at the same time that was happening in the global north. I don't think we need to defend ourselves materially. We can defend ourselves by providing intellect, if that makes sense. Or defense is the wrong word. We can contribute to knowledge in the global north and decolonize, and by producing knowledge, by contributing knowledge, which I think is much more powerful.
No, thanks, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karuni. I had to pick point you there, but we actually did that at the same time. Debbie, what has your interaction been with the Green Building Society of South Africa? Because I once mentioned that the Kruguana is actually the most sustainable building you can ever get. Even if you look at
as long as there's grass.
Yeah, of course. If you look at the criteria to rate a building, right? You're using transport. You're using that is degradable, that it comes back to the ground. The sticks and the grass go back to the ground, and all of that and all of that. Instead of creating a problem and then solve with double glazing. So to speak. I don't know what has your experience been with the Green Building essay. I'm not bashing the green.
What's my experience been?
By the way, I'm just saying that we are not true to who we are as Africans, and how sustainable vernacular architecture is. I don't think we are very true to that.
No, I think you know, everybody in the global north, I mean, I get really angry with them because on the one hand, the consumption in the global north, the materiality of the global north, you know, the sustainability aspect is really pushed as being scientific. And they refuse to accept that social sustainability is the underpinning crux. Because if you can't get people to buy into the economic or the environmental sustainability, you're screwed. So the social sustainability for them, it's all about numbers. It's all about positivism. It's all about the double glazing, as you say, or the triple glazing if you're on the continent. my argument has always been that their understanding of sustainability is all global north. They don't even see the global south. They're not interested in the global south. Okay. And the global south is got a much lower carbon footprint in many ways. But the fact that we're addicted to big cars and SUVs and petrol, sort of driven machines, well, we don't have electricity. So, actually electrical cars are a bit of a problem, but electrical cars themselves are a bloody problem anyway. But this absolute myopia that the global south doesn't exist in the sustainability discourse is very problematic. And, perhaps what we've got to do is we've got to start really working. And maybe this is, okay, I'm now having another idea. Okay, but what we've got to start doing is really working at that sustainable social and the environmental and the economic sustainability crux to be able to start proving stuff to them. And we've got to market ourselves better. At the moment, Africa is just, it's behind the Mediterranean. It's a shocker.
Yeah. No, thanks, Debbie. Any other last comment or question, colleagues, before we close? I think everybody's happy. So just your parting shot, Debbie. I'm in my mind thinking of a follow-up session on land. I think that would be absolutely amazing if we do that. Yeah.
Very, very happy to do that. It'll be much more organized than this one.
No, this was very good. This was very rich. Very enriching. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and good to see many people that I haven't seen for a long time. So thank you for having me, and yeah, we'll see how we go.
Yeah. Till next time. Yeah.
Thanks, Gura. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Till the
Bye-bye.
next one. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.